New data reveals a striking trend. Men are increasingly leaning towards right-wing political views, while women continue to favour the left. In Belgium, a staggering majority of men are now backing the country's two main right-wing parties. Meanwhile, in the UK, Gen Z is showing a surprising surge in right-wing support, surpassing their predecessor generation. This shift is sparking widespread discussion about the evolving political landscape across Europe. It may not be long before parties like Reform UK become a real challenge to the political establishment.
Young men are becoming more conservative, young women more progressive. And this, he thinks, explains quite a lot about what is going on around the world. And he joins me now. John, very good to see you there. Can we just start with the data, since I said data is good? And this is data not just from Britain, but all around the world, including parts of the Far East, yes?
That's right, Andrew. So the basic thing we're talking about here is if you break down the population of any given country into men and women and older people and younger people, what we've generally seen, certainly over the last few decades, is that at any given age group, the men and the women in that age group will have roughly similar views to each other. Like if you took 100 men and 100 women of a certain age, asked them all what they think about something, you'd get similar answers from this.
So pensioners are a bit more right-wing than people in their 30s and so forth, and it crosses the gender gap completely.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
So differences among age, but generally similar between the sexes within an age group. But what we've started to see in the last 5 to 10 years, and as you said, this is not exclusive to any one country. We see it in the UK, a bit in the US, a lot of it in parts of Asia like China and Korea, all over continental Europe, is we've started to see among the youngest, so under 30s, this gap opening up. And so the thing we see pretty much across the board is young women becoming considerably more progressive and liberal than young men. And then in some countries, we also see young men shifting the other way. So this is something we haven't seen before, and we're not seeing this among other age groups now either. We're not seeing older men and women diverge, but we are seeing it among those under 30s.
So there are two really big questions here, John, I guess. One is why, and the other is what does it mean? What will the consequences be? On the why question, this must be the generation who went through lockdown, first of all. Is that a really important part of the story?
So lockdown will certainly have had an impact, that affected all sorts of behaviours and the way we think about the world. But generally with this data, the divergence starts around the sort of 2015 to 2016, 17 period. So that while lockdowns will probably have exacerbated it seems to be something that happened a bit earlier. So there's lots of theories here for what's going on. And I suspect, as with anything, it'll be a bit of all of the above. In some parts of the world, so we talked about Korea and China earlier, there was a significant part of this was related to the Me Too movement. So you had...
Of course, that started then, and you're quite right. I'd forgotten that, yes.
Exactly, yeah. And the reason that was especially significant in East Asia was that some of these countries have very, very wide gender inequality. So it wasn't just the significance of Me Too that we saw everywhere else, but these were also countries where young women felt especially outraged at what they were hearing about and the fact that nothing had been done about this for so long. So that, I think, can explain a certain amount of the shift among young women. And it's not just about young women's views shifting, but young women becoming more confident and vocal in those views. But there are other sort of long-term trends going along here as well. So one thing that I think is still relatively undiscussed is that far more women go to university than men now. Far more boys go to university than girls. So in the UK, for example, about 25% more women go to university than men. And of course, that means different...
And that is a big flip in itself, isn't it, John? That didn't used to be the case. That's a big change in itself.
Exactly that. And so that's going to mean that, to the extent that people go to university, people who go to university end up being more liberal and progressive, that suddenly becomes something that we see more of among young women than men. And on the flip side of that, the young men who are now disproportionately likely not to go to university find their sort of socioeconomic position diminishing. So you go from a position of thinking, if I just work hard, knuckle down, get a decent job, then I'll feel like I'm doing pretty well. But now some people in that group feel like they're not doing as well anymore and they're being overtaken. So that can be part of why we see some young men shift to the right.
So is this a kind of economic industrial aspect to this, that, as it were, heavy industry and a lot of those technological, high status, high pay jobs that men used to value and be valued for have gone away from Western societies, and therefore there's an industrial reason for what you might call the Andrew Tate generation?
Exactly that. So obviously the timings here are all a bit of a mixture. So some of these trends, as you say, are things that have been going on for decades. But I think in the last 10 to 15 years, that's just become especially pronounced for young men. So, when you couple this with the fact that more and more women are going to university, you couple it with the fact that men and women are just simply spending less time together, right? Like the amount of time all of us spend doing things in person versus online is diminishing. We're spending more and more time online. And of course, for young people, when they're online, you increasingly get these sort of filter bubbles. So if you're a young, say, late teens, early 20s man who's not gone to university, there's a significant chance that you're going to be bombarded by things like content from Andrew Tate. If you're a young woman, you're not going to be seeing that at all. So more and more of people's time is being spent in these sort of sex segregated spaces. And so that means that these sort of underlying long running structural factors like that industrial decline are just being sort of catalyzed and exacerbated and brought more to the surface.
That's absolutely fascinating. As I say, I'm not really a data guy, John, but, I amble about town and I observe more and more, and this may just be my prejudice, people socializing in sort of gender-only groups of men, groups of women. I suspect far more than used to be the case. And that brings me to the final big question is, what is the consequence of this? I can see that it can be very, very hard for politicians. They're trying to tailor a message to this generation. They won't know what the hell to do. But what about other implications of this?
Yeah, and I mean, the political point is important as well, because again, you could look at an extreme example in Korea where the Conservative Party in Korea that won the last election has since abolished the Korean Ministry for Gender Equality. So when politics becomes about gender and about sex, then I think half of the population is going to be very unhappy either way. But yeah, certainly there are broader social implications here. So again, if we're starting to see a larger portion of young men and women not seeing eye to eye, then of course those young men and women are not going to end up in relationships. That is going to mean lower birth rates, lower marriage rates, and more, particularly just more young men who feel like lack of sense of.
That's absolutely massive, John. Yes, this story interests me. The more I hear about it, the more I'm interested. And so, is this going to produce a whole new area of data journalism, looking at sexual and gender differences in this particular generation? Is this an entire new academic discipline coming?
Yeah, and look, there's plenty of people already are doing fascinating work in this space in academia and have been for some time now. But yeah, I think if this gap continues to get wider because of these huge social implications, there'll be a lot more research into what can be done to bring the sexes back together.
What do you think of this unexpected change in young men's political views?